You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Amy Gravino, a certified autism specialist, autism consultant, and founder of Ascot, A-S-C-O-T Consulting. Diagnosed with autism at a time when little was understood about it, Amy has overcome many personal and social challenges. She's dedicated her career to advocating for autism acceptance and education, with a special focus on relationships and sexuality. Amy recently developed the Adult Autism and Sexuality Kit, AASK, and she's here to share insights into this important and often overlooked topic. Welcome to the podcast, Amy Gravino.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here today.
Well, I'm appreciative of the fact that you're coming onto the show and talking about a subject that oftentimes isn't brought up, isn't talked about in many of the conferences, although you're out there doing the rounds and helping to bring discussion around it. But before we start talking about relationships, sexuality, and autism, I'd love to know what brought your passion into helping to, I guess, start the discussion, educate, or collaborate on this specific topic?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And when I think about what led me to working in the area of autism and sexuality, I feel like the threads have always been there through my life, even if I didn't know this is kind of what they were leading to. And I was diagnosed as a child as being on the spectrum at the age of 11. Back then, it was Asperger's syndrome. Now it would be autism level 1. And as I began to go through, puberty around that age, I'd say, and began to have the same feelings, questions, curiosities as my neurotypical peers, I didn't, have outlets for exploring my sexuality the way that my peers did. I wasn't going on dates. I wasn't kissing boys under the bleachers. And so I kind of started writing erotic fiction as a way of exploring that. And that was sort of the first step. It was my outlet. I could be free and creative in what I was writing. And it took away the constraints, the fears of, I don't look like this. My breasts are not there. I don't know that I can do these physical acts that people are doing. And I could just be free within that writing. And so that was kind of the first block. And I felt no real sense of shame around that. I didn't feel like this is something wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. I think most autistic people don't naturally feel a sense of shame until somebody tells us that we should feel ashamed of something. And there are some great combinations in this world, like peanut butter and jelly, but sex and shame don't go so well together. They're not a great combination. So I'm thankful that I didn't have those feelings kind of from when I began exploring all of this. And so as time went on, I made friends online who were fans of the Backstreet Boys, and I would write little stories for them in our Yahoo chat rooms about them with one of the members of the Backstreet Boys or NSYNC. And I became like the designated smart writer of our little group of friends. And then, well, I'm trying to think what kind of the next piece of the puzzle would, because that was really, I had nothing in the way of practical experience at that point. Obviously, it was just as far as my virginal 15-year-old mind could stretch, which was pretty far in all fairness. But many years later, I in about 2010, I started an erotic fan fiction website for the Monkees, not the animal, but the band from the 1960s. And so that was kind of another, piece, in that. And then in around that same time, I was completing my master's degree in applied behavior analysis. And I chose for my thesis study to teach to adults on the spectrum how to ask someone out on a date using a mix of written instruction, role playing, and video modeling. And so I knew I wanted to work with autistic adults. I knew there was a lack of services and supports. Again, firsthand experience, obviously, trying to navigate the world as someone for whom this world is not built. And this area in particular, there was nothing in the research literature really to inform this. It just wasn't, you have plenty of things about teaching social skills using ABA, but dating skills are so complex and so different for every scenario. Like you teach somebody how to brush their teeth, that's pretty much the same every time. The task analysis goes the same, the list of things goes the same way. But teaching somebody to go on a date, every date is different, every circumstance is different, every and there's so much nuance that is difficult to address. So that just wasn't kind of present in that literature at that time. But I was really interested in that. And so that was, what I looked at. And then in 2013, Dr. Peter Gerhardt, who's a very dear, good friend of mine, asked me to present with him on sexuality. And this was the first time that I had, even though I've been a professional speaker since about 2006, this was my foray into the area of sexuality and autism. And Peter presented from a clinical perspective, and I presented my personal story. And right off the bat, that's a different way to come at this topic, because I think that the presentations that did exist, maybe let's say 10 years ago, or even slightly before then, were all done by clinicians, always from the clinical perspective. And certain clinicians have no business presenting on this topic because of the manner in which they present on it. And it's, by definition, when we think about disability and sexuality and autism and sexuality, that's always been characterized as something that is aberrant, something that is deviant. It's not that an autistic person might be, many autistic people do engage in fetishes and things of that nature, but just the fact that an autistic person would want to have sex was considered aberrant, abnormal, deviant by the psychological institutions that existed for half a century. So we need to move away from that. And the way we've started to do that, I think, is by having personal perspectives, having people talking about themselves. And when I give my presentations now, it is a mix of the personal and the professional, because I'm now working in this area and I'm able to talk about the work that I'm doing. In 2016, I actually gave a TED talk on autism and sexuality in Jersey City. So I was able to bring that to a larger platform. But because, again, when I give my talks, I share my experiences with sexuality, relationships, getting my heart broken, losing my virginity, all of it. People come up to me after and they will say, I'm not on the spectrum, but I totally related to that. I went through something like that. And that's sort of the whole point, is that what I saw, when I saw the need that needed to be addressed in this area, what I saw was fear from neurotypicals. The fear, number one, of parents, not wanting to see their child as an adult with sexual desires and needs, but then the fear of how this is so different. This is something so separate and other from whatever I might know about sex from my own experiences. How am I supposed to talk about this? And so in talking about my personal experiences, my goal has been to remove that fear, or to alleviate it and hopefully remove it, and show people, yes, we have things that make us different, but there's so much more that we have in common and that makes us alike. And so that's what's led me to where I am now, which is working at Rutgers University as a relationship coach in the Center for Adult Autism Services, and to the work that I have been getting to do now this year in this area.
Well, the way you're approaching it, I'm sure it's illuminated a lot of people's ideas, visions, understanding. And even when you were talking about clinicians, when you are going through this timeline, I'm thinking back to 2011, 2013, is that I would imagine almost everything being taught on relationships was rules, robotic. This is how you do it. This is what the next step, like it was so structured, where relationships are fluid and it takes more concept reasoning. But before we go into the teaching process that you're looking at and how you are approaching this, you had mentioned a couple times the sameness, how there is uniqueness to the autistic experience, but there's also so many similarities. What are those commonalities, and what are the misconceptions that people have created in their heads? You said one of them was that sexual behavior is aberrant for people who are neurodiverse. Well, obviously that's wrong, and we've learned that, but what are some of the other misconceptions that folks have?
That's a great question. I think there are so many misconceptions, and those have kind of influenced why we've been unable to have these conversations. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and the one I often tackle head on, is that autistic people are asexual, which means that they're not interested in sex or have no desire to have sex. And there certainly are people who do identify as asexual who are on the spectrum, and that is completely fine. But a lot of that thinking comes out of what we would refer to as infantilization, which is where we talk about autistic adults as if they're children in big bodies. We say, oh, he's 23 years old with the mentality of a 5-year-old. Well, no, he's 23 years old with the mentality of a 23-year-old who just happens to be autistic and have his challenges, his strengths and needs and so on. And so we do a disservice when we just think that all autistic people must be asexual, must be just big kids, and in big bodies, and I think that is so hugely harmful in that respect. And you were talking about how what used to be taught might have been just very robotic, but I think even 10 years ago, it wasn't even up to that. It wasn't, the steps weren't even being taught yet. It was just more of like, oh, this is, we should discourage all autistic and disabled people from any sexual activity. This is wrong. They can't consent. They don't have the ability. It was all, I think, very much more around that. And it was around safety as well. Autistic people are going to get abused, assaulted. They can only be victims of any kind of sexual activity. They can't be willing, active participants, which is so detrimental. And so, again, that's a larger conversation too when we talk about consent and giving and receiving consent and how that can take different topographies and forms. It can be verbal or nonverbal. But when you just automatically put forward the assumption that because someone has a disability, they can't consent to sex, that I think does even more of a disservice. And I've always been of the mind that if you want to keep someone safe, if we are going to talk about safety, then the best thing to do is to empower them, to give people knowledge and information, to teach people not just about safety, preventing STIs or unwanted pregnancy, but teaching people about pleasure. Because sex is supposed to feel good. That's what it is. That's why humans have been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. So if someone knows their body and knows what feels good for them and what doesn't, that will give them the power and the strength to say, no, don't do that. I don't like that, and I think people have this misconception that if we give people information about sex, they'll want to go out and have sex. And that's simply not true. I found out about sex from probably the worst sources that you could, which is the internet and my peers. And the choice is basically your child is either going to find out wrong information from someone else or correct information from you. Which would you prefer? And maybe it's uncomfortable to want to have those conversations and talk about this, but wouldn't you much rather your child has accurate and correct information, medically accurate as well, than finding things out that are wildly wrong and that could possibly cause them harm? So yeah, these misconceptions, again, they're fed, I think, in some part by popular culture, portrayals of autism in the media, like Sheldon Cooper. And then they're fed in part by our diagnostic criteria as well that were, used to diagnose autism. So there's so much to wade through and kind of disassemble when it comes to those misconceptions. But hopefully we're on the right track.
Absolutely. And I mean, you hit on a variety of things that whether or not somebody is identifying autistic or neurotypical, these are challenges. And some of these challenges is self-awareness. Some of these challenges is knowing where to find appropriate information and really to understand and digest it, because like you said, there's so much thrown at our children, our young adults, that's just so easily, and the adults, that's so easily digestible on the internet that could drive us in the wrong direction, regardless of who we are. Healthy relationships are a challenge. So when we're talking about relationships and sexuality, when you were developing AASK, and would you rather me refer to that as ASK or AASK?
Ask. Ask is good.
When you were developing Ask, what were those unique needs that you focused on? Because this is a challenging subject for everybody, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, setting out to design the Ask curriculum was, a massive undertaking, obviously, figuring out how we were going to focus it, what the lens was going to be for what we were doing. And this was all within the scope of a grant that I had applied for and received. It was my first grant as a principal investigator. We got it in 2022 for $25,000. And I did this in collaboration with Dr. Vanessa Ball, who is part of the Psychological Services Clinic at Rutgers, and also with Dr. Erin Lipsak and Genta Kukaj. And so this curriculum wouldn't exist without them. I just need to say that first and foremost. But our initial, step was to look at the guidelines put forward by the National Standards on Sexual Education. And there are 7 main content areas within that. And so we conducted stakeholder interviews, and and those were with autistic adults, but also the parents of autistic individuals. And we asked them to rank those areas and what they considered to be a priority. And so what we ended up coming away with was healthy relationships and personal safety were the two that were sort of highlighted as being the most important for this population. Um, Being that, again, there's so many ways to come at a curriculum like this. Instead of focusing on building relationships, we decided to focus specifically on preparedness for sex through the lens of healthy relationships and personal safety. So, what that would look like, all the things that would go into that, expectations, versus reality. And then, the thing that I knew in my mind was that I didn't want this to be like other sex ed curricula where people would say, like, this is a neurotypical way to do this, and that's it. I wanted to incorporate autistic communication into the curriculum. I wanted to say, this is the a way to do this. This is how people might expect this to be done, but let's figure out the way that works best with your communication style to help you achieve this particular goal. And the fact that the curriculum incorporated sensory issues that are faced by folks on the spectrum, which is a huge component of sex, obviously. New sights, new smells, textures, bodily fluids, things like that. That was something we knew we wanted to be a part of this as well, and that we wanted it to talk about how to navigate all of that. So there was a lot to consider, in putting this together. And we also, once we had created the content, we originally were looking at Answer, which is the oldest sex ed curriculum in the country, which is housed at Rutgers. And so we were modifying some of the content that was from there, but we developed our own material as well. And then we sent the material to an autistic consultant who gave us feedback on the material, which was enormously helpful. Every step of the way, there was autistic input into this, which I think is so important and distinguishes Ask from other curricula that may be out there. So, and also the fact that what exists now is a foundation. It's not meant to be like an encyclopedia sitting on the shelves in the old days. It's not going to collect dust. We want it to continue to be added to. We want it to be a living document that's informed by the population we're serving. So that was some of the process that was involved in putting it together.
So when you were talking about those surveys, one of the things that just immediately popped in my mind is I don't think that the topics that you came out with from talking and doing the surveying of parents and young adults with identifying as autistic is that those are the same topics I think I would have come up with if I were talking to neurotypical young adults and neurotypical parents of young adults, is that these are concerns that we all have, but there might be unique challenges. And that's what I want to dive into is like, okay, so those are the concerns. Now, looking at some of the barriers or skill sets or some of the uniqueness that some of the folks who identify autistic might have within their personality or within their skill sets, that might change the way you have to tackle some of these questions. And one of the things that I'd love to start with is just the idea of communication challenges. Relationships rely a lot on the ability to be able to communicate effectively with your partner. And how does that come into play? And what is unique and how do you tackle those challenges for autistic adults?
Well, that's a great question. That was certainly something that we addressed within Ask was the communication challenges. And we talked about, what you can do to improve communication with a partner. I mean, I think, the challenge as well is that someone could be in a relationship with someone who's also autistic, with someone who has another disability, or with a neurotypical individual. And the communication issues that will arise will probably be different in every one of those relationships. So it's hard to give very general advice because of that. But we did. I'm trying to remember. It's been several months now, so it's a little blurry in my mind. But we did definitely address that. How you can communicate with a partner. Other methods of communication besides verbal, if it becomes a challenge. Because one of the stakeholders we interviewed was a non-speaking individual on the spectrum who was his caregiver, but he communicated with us beautifully and shared his thoughts. And so we just talked about what that can look like within a given situation in a relationship. How do you step back? How do you look at like the nonverbal aspect as well? The things that somebody isn't saying, those are often challenging to read as well. But also the thing we try to emphasize is that the burden shouldn't always be on the autistic individual to address the communication challenges. It has to come from the other partner as well. It has to be 50-50, right? So I think it would be just as great to have a curriculum that is for neurotypicals to read about being in a relationship with someone on the spectrum, and because all too often that burden does end up on the autistic individual. But that we try to give a starting point at the very least for that. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the fact that every one of these relationships, every one of the partners within the relationship are unique. And being able to understand one's own partner's communication style, how they're expressing themselves, probably is a very big step. Is that something that is recommended, suggested that, that might be one of the primary focuses, is learning how and what your partner is communicating on any given base? And is that a personal kind of focus, or is that something that's taught? How does that work?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I think it really depends. But that's part of being in a relationship, is learning how your partner communicates, learning how they themselves specifically express a given emotion, right? Because we can teach emotions in a clinical environment, but how, angry is going to look different for every person. For some people, angry is shouting and yelling and waving their hands around. For some people, angry is being completely silent. I'm more terrified of the silent people than the yellers, personally, because you don't know what the heck they're going to do. But it's so, and the same thing for like happiness. Happiness can be expressed differently for every person, and so we do encourage that it is about like getting to know your partner and their personal communication style. That what we talk about speaks more generally, but then it is a matter of listening to each other, really listening.
And when we're talking about communication, when it comes to consent, that would be the next thing that kind of follows the path of, I've learned to really communicate with my partner, is that now we are exploring different components of our relationship, and the sexual component as well, is that consent becomes very important.
Yes.
Is this when you're looking at the curriculum through Ask, are you looking at more tacit consent or implicit consent? Like, how are you teaching this so that there's less ambiguity towards the process?
It is. It's very tricky because consent, it's one thing to give it before sexual activities begin, and then in the moment, it's a lot trickier. So we talk about, again, checking in with your partner, making sure that someone's good to go ahead to the next thing. And I always give the example of one of my sexual encounters from a little while ago, where we had been doing other things, myself and my partner. And before we went on to the main event, if you will, he stopped and asked me, "Do you want to blank?" And nobody had ever asked me that before, just checked to see that. And I said, yes, I do. And it was because he'd asked me that I felt even more excited to do it. That it wasn't just assumed that this was the natural course of things. That tends to happen a lot in sexual encounters, is that there's an assumed order in which things proceed. And that was how I viewed my sexual encounters as well. And it didn't occur to me that that they don't always have to go the same way. It doesn't always have to be the same routine. And if you don't want to go to that next step, you don't have to. That wasn't something I understood up until that point. So knowing that now has made all the difference in the world. So in the curriculum we talk about the fact that consent has to be ongoing, right? It's not something that you only check in with once. You have to, check and make sure, and then the things to look for to see if your partner is comfortable or not. People might be saying, okay, yes, but then if they are, like shrinking in on themselves, if they are coming across as uncomfortable for any number of different reasons, those are things to be looking out for. Those non-verbal, again, cues that people give off through the body language. And again, one of the things that I kind of ran into that was really interesting as I was exploring teaching consent is I found on a website they had signs of nonverbal consent and signs of nonverbal non-consent. But almost all the things under nonverbal non-consent were autistic behaviors, and those don't necessarily indicate a lack of consent. Those are just simply how an autistic person might be, but it doesn't mean that they're not consenting. So I just thought, the way we traditionally, I think, even look at consent, it doesn't take disability or autism into consideration because of that. It's the same as, when the police are trained to look for suspicious behaviors in a suspect, those are all things that an autistic person might do, but it doesn't mean that they're a criminal or that they're, so it's the same kind of idea. Is that we have to kind of reframe some of our ideas around especially the nonverbal consent and non-consent as well. So
Yeah, and I mean, so you're talking about the consent through the process and consent beforehand, reading social cues, reading body language. All of these are challenges. All of these are very difficult components of any relationship. Is that understanding that 70% of the communication is going to be through body language and having to read those social cues. When we're talking about, and maybe I'm going to kind of look at the development of some of these skills through a childhood all the way through young adulthood, is that a lot of times is that when you're teaching the historic teaching, not how it should be now, where we're teaching a lot better for autistic individuals, but historically, we taught people to rule follow. We taught people to please whoever the teacher is by responding the way you want them to. We didn't teach the self-determination as well as we should have. We didn't teach assertiveness. We didn't teach assent the way that we should have. Are these things that you're noticing, like, I really wish that this was a priority back when somebody was 2, 3 years old learning all these skills versus trying to figure it out now that they're exploring more evolved relationships?
oh yes, no, absolutely. I mean, things like bodily autonomy and boundaries, those are things that can be taught when someone's 3, 4 years old. You start that it becomes much harder when you start to teach these things later on. Absolutely. Just what you said too about the self-determination piece. Yes, I think we tend to overly focus on compliance. We're, like you said, we're teaching autistic individuals to sit where we need them to sit, wear what we need them to wear, do what we need them to do. And we forget that by teaching someone to always defer to authority, to want to please authority, you're in essence creating a perfect victim, whether intentionally or not. And that non-compliance is just as much of a social skill, right? No is a complete sentence. And we're not great at accepting and acknowledging the no of autistic individuals. So having somebody come in, and they're 19, 20 years old, and their whole life they've been made to feel that their no doesn't really matter. How do you teach someone that it's okay to say no when they've always been taught that they can't say no? And so it's very hard to try to undo that after such a long learning history. And again, I don't think people have malicious intentions necessarily, but they're not thinking about their autistic children as adults. They're not realizing your child's going to grow into an adult and spend the rest of their life as an adult. And so these things have to start and be taught in childhood. You're not going to preserve someone's innocence by not teaching them about these things. You're going to just set them up to again potentially be victimized because they won't have that knowledge. They won't have that information. And it breaks my heart, because it just happens time and again. People will know who to take advantage of. They'll know who is going to have a hard time saying no to them, who's going to feel like they can't. I was that girl. I mean, that was me, I think, for a time, and also because of my low self-esteem and the fact that I felt that if I said no, then no, the voice in my head was, well, maybe no guy will ever be interested in me again. Maybe no other guy will ever want to see me naked again. So I have to say yes. And I wish I could go back to that 19, 20-year-old girl and tell her, no, like, you don't have to do this. Like, you're gonna be fine. Like, these jerks are desperate and sad. You don't need to do anything for them. But I just didn't have that sense of self-awareness at that time. And oh, I see, a lot of young women on the spectrum now, and a lot of them remind me of me, and I just want to protect them from the world and kill anybody who would ever hurt them. But I know that the way that I can protect people is by giving them knowledge and helping them learn how to navigate all of this
Yep.
instead of thinking this is not something that's going to apply to these people. If you as the parent think this is not going to apply to my child, you're not helping your child. You're not,
Mhm.
you're deciding that an entire piece of humanity is somehow not for them or not going to affect them. And that's not true. And that's not how we could thrive and succeed in this world when you're no longer here with us.
Yeah, but even having these conversations right now is that you're seeing an evolving path of just everybody's views. We're not there yet. We're not these conversations need to continue, and education still needs to continue to evolve. But is that having these conversations hopefully gets back to the clinicians. I'm a BCBA myself, is that the
Yes.
clinicians would start to understand, hey, you know what? I need to start prioritizing a lot of these other skills earlier in my support of any sort
Yes.
of individual that's receiving care. Is that these are the skills that are going to be necessary in so many different areas of life for somebody to be successful. And social relationships, sexual relationships are an important part of many people's lives. It's a priority to have
Yes.
both of those things intact. So I think that it's really important, and it ties back to the communication, because if you're taught only to respond in one way, is that
Mhm.
you become muted in the way that you should be or want to be communicating some of your other feelings. So, one of the other things that kind of I'd love to understand how the Ask curriculum works through are some of the sensory sensitivities and discussions that occur within relationships, sexual relationships for autistics, and what Ask goes about in their curriculum as far as teaching on that.
Sure. Well, yeah, that was something I had mentioned earlier that we do address, the sensory challenges that can arise during sex. And so we talk about, are there ways you can familiarize yourself before you're actually going to go have sex with somebody? Like get used to the sight of what their body looks like, what your body looks like without clothes on. Maybe we have people who don't ever see themselves naked. And that again, I could say that applied to me again because of my low self-esteem. I hated myself, so I didn't want to see myself. And so I wasn't very familiar with my body for a long time. And it's such a difference when you are. It's such a difference when you know how your body looks and you're comfortable in your skin and you know what feels good and what doesn't feel good. So figuring that out before you're actually uh, in the bedroom, like talking with the partner about, oh, I like firm touches, but I don't like soft little touches, or I'm very sensitive in my ears or on my back, or I can't handle like sweat. Sweat is really overwhelming, and so how maybe finding clothes that are moisture wicking that might help with the sweat absorbency. Figuring out and the thing that I always say is interesting to me too. There are sensory things that I might have a challenge with if my partner was somebody that I wasn't as attracted to, but when it's someone I'm really attracted to, those things diminish. Like I have the same things that I have a problem with anyone else. I have no problem with that partner. Yeah, it really it can depend, right? It really can. Because of how you feel about someone, you're attracted to someone. It's easier. It's just funny how that can happen, but it does. Um, and so, yeah, letting people know it doesn't mean that your sensitivities don't exist anymore. It just means that you may be better able to navigate them because of the person that you're with, right? And I think that might not be something we actively think about in relationships, but I think it's true for neurotypicals too. There's things that, if anybody else was doing this, I wouldn't put up with it, but this is, I love this person, so I actually don't mind it because they're the one doing it.
Hmm.
So again, it's we tend to try to make relationships so black and white, and they're really not. It's so much more complex than that. Um,
Yeah.
and especially for autistic individuals, the sensory thing I think plays into that. It really, like if I'm with someone who I know respects me and cares about me, I'm going to have a much easier time with whatever sensory things are arising than if I'm with someone that I feel like doesn't care about me or doesn't respect. Like it's like night and day. It's just
Hmm.
night and day. So
Absolutely. And I think that's where that trust piece comes in. And maybe this is where one of those misconceptions aligns, is that one of the things that I've heard, and I feel like has been debunked, but not well enough, is that these close relationships or the close emotional relationships are something that autistic individuals have not been able to successfully attain. And I know this isn't the case because there's so many healthy relationships, but where does that trust piece come in, and what, oh, I guess start with the misconception, but then also how does somebody start to build that trust in those relationships so that they can get to that point?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think the misconception arises because autistic people may not behave within relationships in a way that's typically expected, and it kind of falls in that line of, the diagnostic criteria talk about a lack of empathy that autistic people may express, and I don't think I think it's nothing could be further from the truth. I think rather than nothing getting in, it's that everything gets in, and so many of us are unable to filter those things out. And so similarly, the idea of love, that there's only one way to show love, but in fact, there are many ways of showing love. And if an autistic person in a relationship, you know, that relationship can look different from the outside to someone who is used to more typical relationships, but it doesn't make it less valid. It doesn't make it less of a loving relationship. Um, but that I think adds to that misconception. Um, and in terms of building the trust, again, we very frequently, neurotypicals demand that autistic people trust them. We demand that an autistic person trust this neurotypical person to help them get dressed or to help them get ready for school. To we demand that we trust people to help us with medical problems. And historically, and it pains me to say it, but historically, neurotypicals have abused that trust time and time again. And yet, the idea that autistic people, are robotic or don't have emotions the same way that neurotypicals do speaks to the notion that we shouldn't feel a sense of betrayal, or that we don't understand that our trust has been violated, that it somehow shouldn't matter to us because we're not, quote, normal. And that nothing could be farther from the truth. Again, we don't forget betrayals. We may not be able to describe that feeling of being betrayed, but we know what it is. We know how terrible it feels. And then to have people again demand our trust over and over. I mean, when I was younger, I wanted to trust people. I wanted to believe that people had good intentions. I'm a failed pessimist. I can't help it. I always want to see the best in people. But I've learned to be more judicious in to whom I extend my trust, because unfortunately, people don't always have my best intentions at heart. Unfortunately, some people have some very nefarious intentions at heart. And so I think we need neurotypicals to step away from the idea that it's implicit that an autistic person is going to trust them, and reframe it as that they need to earn the trust of an autistic person.
Absolutely. You have to earn the trust of everybody. Is that why would it be so different just because you're dealing with somebody who maybe has a different perspective, perception of the environment or the world around them? When you've gotten some of the feedback, because like you said, is that the Ask curriculum is an iterative process. It's continuously evolving and moving on. What is the feedback that you've gotten so far, and what are people asking for more information on right now?
I mean, the feedback has been very positive so far. We ran it with a group at Rutgers back in January, and we did conduct post group surveys in order to get feedback from the participants. I think by and large they did find it very helpful. We again because everybody's coming from a different place in terms of what education they've received prior to this, so we have some very kind of basic stuff about like what is a boundary and what is a value, and things like that, just as a starting point. And also we have some things that cover anatomy and biology, just again mainly as a review, but also because we don't know that people necessarily have received that information prior to encountering the curriculum. So, but some people found that a bit too remedial. Some of that stuff they felt that they were ready for the more advanced stuff. So it's we had some suggestions about like the pacing, picking up certain things. So right now that's what we're looking at, is kind of restructuring some of what, not necessarily what we're teaching. Most of the content we feel pretty solid about, but kind of in what order we're teaching things. And we're looking at packaging it right now. That's kind of the next step, is to get this into some kind of a format that is going to be a tangible thing that people can look at it. I've had interest actually from other organizations and schools who want to use the curriculum for their students. So it's been very positive in that respect that I've been receiving all this interest. I've gotten a lot of emails from people who want to study the scope of the curriculum, and I'm over here like, I can't do that yet because it doesn't exist. Like, so that's, but I'm very excited that people are interested in it. I'm very happy that people, think that this is going to be something helpful. And there's a curriculum out of Boston University called the Hearts curriculum, which I was part of one of their advisory boards regarding that. And that focuses more on building relationships, building healthy relationships. And so I feel like Hearts and Ask are very complementary to each other. I think that because we cover more of sex and preparedness for sex. And so I think that together, those two, could really be beneficial. But I'm very happy that people are wanting this and wanting to, we're looking at potentially adapting it again for other populations, like individuals with ID or individuals who are a little bit younger than college age or younger. So that's, again, all potential future directions, for the curriculum. And I'm excited that those are all possibilities.
And I would imagine everybody else is waiting on pins and needles as well, just because, there's not enough information out there. There aren't enough guides to be able to help start these conversations. But one of the things that you do so well, and that you mentioned, a lot of people, when you're out there doing presentations or talking about the subject, have appreciated, is the fact that you're intertwining personal experience. I would imagine is that a lot of the teaching going on, there's going to be improvement along the way for the educators on the delivery of it. So that it isn't so rote, so boring. So
Yes.
it's in order to get that conversation and to elicit more of the questions that are going to be necessary to start kind of diving deeper into. So what suggestions do you have to some of the educators as they start to gain some of the curriculum out there, the Ask curriculum in particular, and how to use it effectively?
Well, that's a great question. Again, part of what I'm looking to offer as a package with the curriculum is me coming in to train the clinicians, actually, to talk to the teachers about how to implement this and what and why. Well, first of all, why they need to do this. Not necessarily to the people who contact me, but like the staff at these organizations who to gain buy-in so they understand the importance of this. And I think, again, like you said, when they hear from me and they hear the personal experience, I think that really makes it hit home in a very significant way. I mean, and the thing I always say to clinicians too is what I said earlier, which is that you don't have to have all the answers. The entire point of this is that this is about creating a conversation with your students, your clients, creating a conversation with the parents, creating a conversation with your administrators, right? We have to start talking about this. That's the way that this becomes easier. It's not the kind of thing where I hand you this envelope like underneath the hotel door in the middle of the night, and then you go off with this super secret information. We're bringing this into the light of day. That's the whole point, is to take it out of the dark ages, take it out of being something that's taboo and forbidden, and make it accessible for everybody. And so the way we do that is we say, like, this is messy, this is complicated. Neurotypicals don't know how to do all this. They just fake it better and hide it better. And so don't feel like you as an autistic person are the only one who struggles with this. Like, just being open about that, I think, makes such a huge difference. I think, if you try to present yourself as the big authority who knows everything, that's not going to be a comfortable thing, I don't think, for the clients you support, because they don't want to feel like, well, if I don't have an answer, this person knows everything and they're going to think I'm stupid. And like, that's not going to cultivate, a healthy conversation and a positive environment. So it's the whole idea of, this is a starting point. This is not the be all end all. This is to hopefully get that ball rolling and show you that there's a way to talk about this and a way to make these conversations possible.
And so much more attainable for the educator as well, is that I think in pretty much all walks of life, the more humble you are about your own knowledge set, the better it's going to be for those that you're collaborating with. And I think that this sounds like it's a collaborative process, is that no matter who's in the room, somebody's bringing something novel to the discussion that you are going to learn from, and everybody else will. So the facilitation sounds like so key. So I'm glad that you're a part of that when you're teaching the curriculum, because Otherwise, I think people might feel lost. So
Yeah.
what are some of the other resources? You mentioned the heart curriculum, and I know that
Yes.
you're involved with so much of the work in this space because there aren't a lot of Amy Gravinos out there that are studying this subject and out presenting. What are some of the other resources that we can reach out and use to educate ourselves or explore more topics?
Sure, sure. Well, two that come to mind. One is the Sex Ed for Self Advocates from the Organization for Autism Research. That's free and available online. It's for individuals on the spectrum age 15 and up. Uh, Dr. Peter Gerhardt and I actually recorded the introductions to all of the sections, and parents can read along and clinicians can read along. It's very comprehensive. Covers everything from hygiene to safety to dating, abuse, sexuality. All that is in there. And then the other one that comes to mind is Elevated Training, which is by Catherine McLaughlin. And she's physically disabled, so that it initially was focused more, I think, on support for individuals with physical disabilities, but now there's much more for individuals with developmental disabilities as well, all about how to teach this area. Again, very comprehensive. Again, not perfect. Bear in mind, there is no perfect resource. Every resource is going to have high points and less strong points. So just, from any resource you look at, take from it what is useful to you and leave behind the stuff that's not. That's the way I look at it.
No, and I think just even having a starting point is so important just to be able to kind of start the conversation and continue it with your colleagues. But I appreciate those resources. We'll definitely link to them. Where can folks get your information or be able to kind of get more of the direct access to the Ask curriculum?
Well, again, the Ask curriculum is not published at this moment. It's not really available for public consumption yet, but hopefully soon. That's what we're aiming for. My website is amygravino.com, and you can reach me at amy@amygravino.com or at amy.gravino@rutgers.edu. I'm also on Twitter or X and Instagram and on LinkedIn, so I can be found on any of those platforms.
Well, Amy, I appreciate you coming on and having this discussion with us today. Once again, like every single time I have a guest come on, I feel like I walk away with more questions, some more knowledge for sure, but more questions than I ever started with. So thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.